The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
This week, the province announced that rapid testing could be coming to a school or childcare center near you. We'll find out more tonight. Then our Ontario hubs explain QR codes and how they'll be used by the province for vaccine passports and beyond. Also, from how police deal with protesters to what's behind the housing shortage, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, October 8th, and that's next on The Agenda. Ask any parent how the school year is going, and odds are they'll mention the fear and hassle around COVID screening and testing. Could rapid or at-home testing make life both safer and easier? With us on that in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Dr. Lisa Barrett, clinician, scientist, and infectious disease physician at Dalhousie University and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And here in Ontario's capital city, Dr. Isaac Bogoch, infectious diseases physician at the University Health Network and a scientist based out of Toronto General Hospital and the University of Toronto. Hi to you both.
Great to see you again.
Looking forward to this conversation. You know, I don't want to start off by complaining because I think we're very lucky to live in a province where we have access to healthcare. But I think a lot of us who've had the COVID test, you know, the one that they stick up your nose and it feels like it's tickling your brain. It's very uncomfortable. But that test, I guess, would be considered the gold standard in COVID testing. How are take-home rapid tests different from PCR testing? Dr. Barrett?
Well, it actually depends on exactly the format that you're using. There are many tests that are or will be approved in Canada for at-home use. But across all of those is a difference from the nose tickle you were talking about, in that this is a much more shallow or front of the nose type of test. The swab goes in a couple of centimeters into the front of the nose. You swirl it around yourself and not require an additional person. That can happen in individuals who are smaller kids, right on up to very much older folks. And that test then goes into whatever format the downstream part is. But the swabs are all very similar, front of the nose, no brain tickling at
It does feel like it, but Dr. Bogoch, how effective are these rapid tests?
So the short answer is they're very effective. The more nuanced answer is it depends on what question you're trying to ask. Right? The PCR tests are exquisitely sensitive in the sense that they will detect shreds of genetic material that's in the back of your nose. That could include someone who's got a rip-roaring infection. That could include someone who's recovered from a rip-roaring infection and still has genetic shreds in the back of their nose. That could be someone before they start to even develop symptoms and they're starting to build up their viral load. The PCR test is very, very sensitive in picking up genetic material. The rapid tests really address the question, am I contagious to other people right now? Yes or no. So you typically have to have more virus present for those rapid tests to be positive. But you can imagine if you're addressing that question, am I contagious to other people? Not, do I have shreds of genetic material in the back of my nose? You can still make some very, very well-informed decisions based on your behavior. And I'm sure we'll get into that later on in this chat.
You know, there's been a frustration in the province from parents who want access to these rapid tests. And then hearing back from the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Kieran Moore, about why we might not be using them right now. Are there any benefits to these rapid tests over the PCR tests, Dr. Barrett?
Well, again, I think it really does depend on the question you're trying to ask and what you're trying to do in a given jurisdiction. Here in this province, in Nova Scotia, we have a couple of areas where there is a fair amount of community spread, and I would say most places in the country right now have areas with community spread. And we recognize that when unvaccinated kids go back to school, we have a question. Do these people who have one or two symptoms, not fever or cough, but one or two symptoms, do those kids have COVID or not? Or is this some other of the plethora of other viruses that are around in the community? In other words, should our kids stay home or not? And so for that kind of question, these rapid antigen tests are actually pretty useful in that they get you a quick and easy answer at home. And if they're not the major symptoms, you can actually get your kids to school instead of having to keep them home potentially. Although we are encouraging folks who are sick to stay home. The second question would be in places where you're in a rural area or somewhere without easy access to PCR testing, we want to make sure in Canada, I would expect, that we have some good equity in terms of access to testing. And this would be a good example where rapid antigen tests may also augment that lack of PCR availability in the short run. Quick, easy, fast answers for parents, especially if you repeat the test a couple of days later, which gets over that slight decrease in sensitivity that Dr. Bogoch was mentioning.
Well, earlier this week, Ontario announced that it will offer rapid COVID-19 tests to some schools and childcare settings in what they're calling higher risk areas for unvaccinated and asymptomatic students. Dr. Bogoch, what do you think of this plan?
I think it's fantastic that the province is going to start using rapid testing in a manner that will help create a safer school environment. That is great. When you compare that to not doing rapid testing, it's certainly a major step in the right direction. I think we could debate on the merits of various rapid testing programs and how to use them and where to use them. And of course, a lot of those decisions will depend on resources available and also who you ask. I mean, let's just call it how it is. There's still considerable debate within the medical, scientific, and public health community about the best mechanism and the best way to deploy these rapid tests. But the fact that they're deploying them is already a step in the right direction. And I think if they do this we actually don't have a ton of details as to how they're going to do it. A lot of this is at the discretion of the local medical officer of health. I think we might see some heterogeneity in how these are deployed across the province. Currently, we're hearing whisperings that they're going to use these in more high burden areas. Okay, that's a start. There's other ways of doing this. For example, rapid testing at home before sending kids to school. But of course, you have 2.1 million kids going to school. That's a lot of rapid tests if you have to do that 5 times a week. And we'd run into serious resource issues at this point in time. There's other programs you could do. For example, if there's an outbreak in a school, there's the test to stay approach. Rather than send everybody home, you have people who might have been exposed, enable them to come to school if they have a negative test result. Like, what I'm trying to say is there's multiple ways that you can deploy these rapid tests in a meaningful manner. It's yet to be clear how Ontario will deploy these, and I look forward to them actually using these because it's a lot better than not. If you don't use these tests, you will identify 0 people coming to school with a potential infection. If you do use these tests, you will identify and hopefully alleviate and prevent some people from coming into the school.
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that because there is a little bit of confusion. I'm glad that you said that you don't know how it's going to work out because for a lot of people, we're hearing higher risk areas. And, we know that the province has said, for teachers who who are not vaccinated for whatever reason, that they're going to be tested weekly. We do know that there's kids under 12 are not eligible to be getting vaccinated. So I think there's a little bit of confusion about if you're going to use it in high risk areas, why not just use it everywhere? Dr. Bogoch?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. If you had the resources available, like if you had an infinite number of tests and the capability to deploy these either at the school or at the home, it'd be great. Imagine if every day someone did a rapid test and said, you know what, my test is negative. I've got a green light. I can go into work or I can go into school because I know my risk today for transmission is exceedingly small. If almost negative, almost 0. But of course, nothing's 0 or 100%. But I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that we have those resources available to us. And in fact, it's been publicized in many media outlets that there is a shortage of rapid tests and issues with supplying rapid tests because they're in such high demand in many countries around the world. So it would be nice to know what the resources we have available to us now so that we can deploy these rapid tests in a meaningful manner that's basically commensurate with what we have available. And of course, we could always plan for expanding these programs if we have more of these tests available moving forward.
I read that in Ontario, we have access to 4 million rapid tests right now. I could be wrong, but Dr. Barrett, other jurisdictions around the world are using rapid testing in schools, including the UK. And Nova Scotia recently introduced a pilot program. Do we have any evidence for how effective these programs are?
Well, again, it comes back to the question that you're trying to ask. And if your question is, am I going to get and identify folks who don't have any symptoms and prevent them from going to school. There are some programs that are starting to show that, yes, of course, that this does happen and does work. People get into the nitty-gritty of questions around tests that we don't need to be asking right now, like, well, what's the false positive, false negative rate? And there is data out there on that, and it says that if you have a reasonable amount of virus around in your community, the false positive rate is exceedingly low, and also that the false negative rate is appropriate, especially for serial testing. So if the question is, are you going to pick up people who otherwise would have been around other unvaccinated people, meaning kids at this point, hopefully? Yeah, you do find out that that is the case. And I would assert that it doesn't matter if that's one person or if that is 50 people, because the other part that you're going to manage to do is give people engagement in testing, destigmatize the COVID positivity situation, so to take away some of the stigma of being COVID positive, and engage people in healthy activities like knowing their status until we're further along in this particular pandemic. So other than just finding people, there's a huge amount of evidence and emerging evidence that engagement in this type of testing is an important part of being community associated and community led, which is just as important on the behavior front as anything else.
Dr. Bogoch, Dr. Barrett mentioned false positives, and that was a concern that was raised by Dr. Kieran Moore earlier this week in very low-risk settings, and he said that they can produce false positives. Is this something that we should be worried about, or is this something that maybe is just adding another layer of confusion?
Listen, I think you can't ignore that there will be some false positives, but I think the rate and the impact of these is much lower than what many would suggest. Here's the beautiful part about a rapid test. It's rapid. Like, you can always redo the test, or you can follow up, for example, with a PCR test. I mean, I really think that these concerns are not entirely overblown, but sometimes overblown, because you can create policy to account for this, right? You can teach people, as Dr. Barrett says, teach people how to use these tests and when to use these tests and what to do with a positive or a negative result. Like, these are wonderful opportunities to engage communities in really taking control and empowering people and communities to really ensure that they can be actively a part of creating a safer community environment, a safer school environment. Like, we can do this. We absolutely can. I really think that one of the bigger limitations now might be a supply limitation, and I think supply would limit the scope of a rapid testing program. The other is our creativity, right? Like, in a perfect world with unlimited resources, these could be ubiquitous. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where you have formal programs like what Dr. Barrett discussed in terms of rapid testing in rural underserviced communities, or rapid testing like we're talking about here to create safer schools. But you could also take these tests out of the hands of the medical, scientific, and public health world and put them in the community. So have them easily available, and again, teach people how and when to use these and how to interpret positive and negative results. Much like pregnancy tests are widely available. And I'm not saying throwing testing at a problem is a silver bullet and will solve all our issues. Of course it won't. But it certainly is a helpful tool in a toolkit to help create safer indoor spaces. And we certainly can empower people to use these tests in a smart manner. And this will help. Like, this can certainly help. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it can certainly help make this pandemic a lot more bearable and create safer indoor spaces.
Dr. Barrett?
Well, just to follow up on that, again, I think that's an extension. We had a conversation around our group this morning. You know, when do we stop trying to figure out how to comms everything, how to communicate when and if and how, and just turn this into a very much here's the test, like, folks, this is for you. We talk all the time in medicine and public health about wanting people to own some control over what happens to them and how they do it. This is a perfect example that, and we've been trying to do that in Nova Scotia. Hand this to people, offer a tool, here's something you can do to help. And it's really not an outdated concept with testing. I would say it's coming into its own, particularly with high rates of vaccination. Until we get everyone under 12 vaccinated and we have another season of immunity developed through exposures, we're going to need to keep community virus at a reasonable level without locking down. And being able to detect how much virus is around in our communities is an important thing. And that involves a heck of a lot more asymptomatic, super rapid testing. So really a time to think creatively and come into our own on some of these topics, especially in Canada, where we really talk a lot about this concept of having people have autonomy. Well, now it's time to put our money where our mouth is with respect to public health testing for infectious disease.
And I know for parents who are watching the winter season coming up, kids get sniffles with everything, and you always get nervous about, is this COVID or is this, and I just want to add, like, anyone who has younger kids are very smart. My kids are now, I think I'm not really feeling well. Oh, my throat hurts. Then you have to keep them home because they're manipulating the situation. But that's just an aside.
Maybe your kids are.
Very smart. But it would give people, I think, a sense of control and, that peace of mind instead of going to get a test. And if you're missing work to go get your kids tested every day in this winter, it will create a lot of problems. But I wanted to read something from a column that Matt Gurney wrote for TVO.org in response to what Dr. Moore was saying about focusing on high-risk areas. And this is what Matt wrote, and the board is called, "What the hell took so long?" I'm sorry for cursing. But Matt writes, "This makes sense on the face of it, but also gives the government some tiny bit of cover. Well, it doesn't make sense everywhere, but it's worth trying in high-risk areas. Isn't much of a defense for a government that could have mandated what it announced Tuesday many months ago before school had even resumed. But it's marginally better than nothing. So yes, let's celebrate today's news. Tomorrow, we can get back to wondering what the hell took so long." Dr. Bogoch, what's changed since the beginning of the school year until now to bring in rapid testing?
I honestly don't know. I truly don't know. It might be external pressure, but there might be other things that sometimes we're just not privy to that are happening behind the scenes. And but yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately.
And Dr. Barrett, the Ontario school plan, as we mentioned, is targeting high-risk areas for rapid tests. Do you think they should be widely available for all students?
Again, depends on the question, but I think the answer to the beginning part here is that it makes sense for kids who are not vaccinated to have access. And if you have a supply problem, then you start with something smaller. But I think asking the right question first and answering it, which is probably that, yeah, everyone should have access to this. This virus, just to come back to the virus bit for a moment, it moves incredibly quickly. And if we always use hospitalizations and epidemiology, that's a week behind, to make decisions about where virus is, I mean, the virus laughs at that. It's like, wow, how have you folks not learned? So only targeting high-risk areas sets yourself up to develop more high-risk areas. And if you can prevent that by using widespread testing and you have the resources to do it, which I would argue should be available, then that makes the most sense to me, because yesterday's low-risk area is tomorrow's high-risk area.
I wanted to share a tweet here from Harvard epidemiologist Michael Mina, and they wrote, "Symptoms do not mean more virus. Nope. Symptoms can actually even mean less virus sometimes, because symptoms are often the result of the immune response. Often people develop symptoms after peak viral load." So does being symptomatic or asymptomatic matter for how accurate these rapid tests are? Dr. Bogoch.
There's a lot to unpack there. We know that there's a concept of pre-symptomatic transmission, meaning you have a growing amount of virus in your body. You're going to develop symptoms in a day or 2 days, but you've got a lot of virus there. You don't feel unwell just yet. You will soon, and you're transmissible to others. That's a concept that's extremely important, and rapid testing can certainly pick up that virus at some point when you cross a certain threshold. There's people who are completely asymptomatic. They're infected, the virus is in them, they have no symptoms whatsoever from the time they start with the virus to the time they have no virus left in their body. And there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that people in that category aren't as transmissible as others. Now, again, I wouldn't say that's case closed. There's growing evidence suggesting that, but there's still some scientific debate over that. I think the point that Dr. Barrett made earlier was fantastic in that, these rapid tests in asymptomatic well people can serve a purpose if the goal is to identify people who might have virus in them, especially in the pre-symptomatic phase, and prevent them from going into work or school and infecting others. The other important point, too, is that we know some people have mild symptoms. Sometimes that's referred to as polysymptomatic. And, when you just do a very cursory history, people say, no, I'm fine. But when you actually drill down, they do have symptoms. They're not at their baseline. And that's called polysymptomatic. And those are people that have symptoms. Like if it's a binary question, are they symptomatic? The answer is yes. It's just that they're mild symptoms. And sometimes those people, unfortunately, artificially get categorized as being asymptomatic, which is not accurate. And those are people who are symptomatic, just mildly symptomatic, and can still transmit the virus if they're infected. So the point is, these rapid tests will detect if the virus is there. Symptoms don't always tell the entire picture. Broad rapid testing would really help. If it's fast, if the resources are there, if it's fast, if it's widely available and you can get an answer, am I contagious to others, yes or no, in real time, that can certainly drive smart behaviors like, should I send my kid to school or should I go to work?
I wanted to read quickly from something from the person the tweet I just read, Harvard's Michael Mina. And this is something they wrote in New York Times on October the 1st. They write, before rapid tests, people had to assume they could be contagious from COVID-19. That's why people isolated themselves and businesses and schools closed. It is why people missed holidays with their families. But by embracing rapid tests alongside vaccination, people can live with the virus. Workplaces can sustainably reopen. Children can stay in school. The United States should use rapid testing as a complement to the vaccine. Our leaders must work quickly to make this a reality. Dr. Barrett, you've mentioned a few times, it depends on the question that you're asking, but we do know that we're going to be living with with the virus for some time now. To what extent is rapid testing essential to helping end this pandemic?
So ending is not the way I'd put it, but what I would say is vaccines are a star quarterback. We're not going to get out of this. This team is not going to win until we have vaccines, and we need that star quarterback. Sending the star quarterback out on their own to win a team event is silly. And the tests, these rapid tests to find and dampen down rapid virus movement is really key. And if we use those two tools together, along with some basics like masking, that will get us through far faster without lockdowns. And so question independent, rapid tests with rapid virus and a star quarterback vaccine is a team that's going to win over the virus.
And Dr. Bogoch, we've got about 30 seconds.
I would just request that we use hockey analogies instead of football ones on this channel.
What about basketball? Anyway.
All right, that too. Yeah, I mean, we're underutilizing these in Canadian settings. We're starting to utilize them more and more. If we use them in a smart manner, I think we can do a lot of good with these. In the example that was given here, you can use these in a quote-unquote test-to-stay approach where you don't all have to go home and isolate for 14 days if you had a possible exposure. A negative test could enable people to stay in class or continue to go to work. There's good data backing this up and growing data backing this up. There's a lot of different ways that rapid tests can be implemented into our day-to-day lives. We're only starting to do this. We're a bit behind the 8 ball here. I hope if we have access to these resources, we deploy them broadly because they can do a lot of good.
Dr. Bogoch, Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for sparing some time for us. And if it hasn't been said, we really do appreciate all the work that you're doing to help guide us in this most unusual time. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On Ontario's new QR code identification system for vaccine passports comes into effect later this month. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for Ontario Hubs, and he's been looking into how privacy and safety concerns, or even breaches, could affect future plans by the government to create a multi-use digital ID. And Justin Chandler joins us now from Hamilton. Hey, Justin.
Hey there.
All right, so Ontarians have been showing their proof of vaccination in the form of PDFs alongside their government-issued ID since September 22nd. You've been looking into sort of the privacy and safety angle there. What are some of the concerns that you've seen so far?
Well, one of the biggest concerns that I'm seeing is based around the actual security of these documents when it comes to fraud. As it stands, one is able to edit the information on their vaccine receipt without the use of specialized software. And this is something that the government is aware of. They tell me that they trust Ontarians will do the right thing and that most people would not be trying to do this. They say that their documents are securely watermarked, but this does not stop someone from going in and changing information.
And just to clarify, when you say going in and changing information, we're talking about in that PDF form, going in and manually changing names and sort of information like that, correct?
Yes, exactly. On a vaccine receipt, yes.
Got it. Now, later this month, the province is going to be introducing a sort of QR code that will sort of enhance the sort of system. We have a photo here. This is of a generic QR code, and QR stands for quick response. How exactly will this system work, and how does it differ from the current system we have right now?
So QR codes are, as you showed there, they're little square barcodes, and they can be read by a camera phone. So somebody is able to scan a QR code and it can take them to a link or certain type of information. So what the plan as it currently has been laid out is people in Ontario will be able to go onto the government website in the same way that they've been able to download their vaccine receipts and download what the province is calling an enhanced vaccine certificate, which will be in the form of a QR code. So that will be available for digital storage, or one could print it. And the idea is that they'll be able to take this code with them to the same places that they would currently take their vaccine certificate. And they would show that to the person at the door who's checking that. And these people will use an Ontario-made app in order to scan the code. And then it'll show up to say this person's name and whether or not they've been vaccinated. So pairing that with showing the ID, that's how showing one's own ID. That's how you'll prove that you've been vaccinated if you're using the code. However, I should also add, the old system will still be accepted. So this new thing is coming in, but if for whatever reason you don't want to do that, you'll still be able to keep doing what you've been doing up to this point.
So you had mentioned that this is an Ontario-based app, and so the province has decided to build this in-house, and there are other provinces and cities that have decided to sort of act faster and have sort of been already dishing out QR code system already. How has that been playing out in certain jurisdictions like Quebec?
So the way that Quebec is doing this is that they have people download an app. So residents get an app and businesses get an app that can be used to verify. And that's where the QR code is coming from. But as we understand from Ontario's plan, as it's been laid out, the broad strokes are basically the same. So a person will be showing a QR code, getting it scanned, and then that spits out whether or not they've been vaccinated. And that's how we're determining this. And security experts who've looked at the Quebec system have, for the most part, said that it looks pretty good. There have been a couple examples where it seemed it might be possible to fake a code, although presumably that would be much more difficult than the PDF. And there have been suggestions that it might be possible to build like a fake scanner that would log some information about the person. But one of the benefits of the QR code that the Ontario government has also promoted is that less information is being shared. So if you have, for example, just your name and your vaccination status coming up, currently the receipts also show like your birthday and the last 4 digits of your health card number, where you got your shot, et cetera. So this is a means of putting out less information than one currently is.
Is there concern, though, that, we saw the QR code for a lot of people, who have been maybe venturing out to restaurants and stuff? When I see a QR code, I think menu now and stuff like that. But that little code has lots of information. What are people saying about, do they know that, do they trust a system like this? Are you hearing anything in terms of people maybe not opting out to use a QR code and maybe staying with sort of the PDF version of the vaccine? passport?
It's tricky at this point. From people who I've been speaking to about whether or not this is a trustable system, the idea at this point is that, yes, it seems like Ontario is following the right steps here. And the government does say that it's going to make the app open source, which means that the code will be put out publicly so that researchers and people who really understand this, people who are independent from the government, can look it over and they can say, okay, this is good, or maybe there's a flaw here, just in the same way that a mechanic can look at your car and tell you whether it's working without you having to be an expert yourself. So there's going to be that sort of ability for people to be able to, I think, or maybe I should say for the government to be able to earn the trust of people by making this information public.
Now, on top of October 22nd, the government has also promised later this year to introduce and roll out what's called a digital ID. I want to pull up a photo, and this graphic is from the Ontario.ca website. Can you describe what we're looking at here and what's sort of this process?
Yes, this is sort of part of their tech plan for the digital ID, which is an incoming digital credential that we'll have. So this is another tool that's going to be optional. But the way it will work is that the government will be able to issue sort of a key that will connect to a person's identification. So let's say their name, address, all of that, like you would have on your driver's license. A person will be able to apply in order to get that key and that information, which they'll be able to then store on a device, for example, in their digital wallet. And then there will be a way for businesses or for government institutions to be able to verify the ID and actually determine whether or not a person is who they say they are.
Now, you've talked about this in your article for TVO.org, but I imagine, this is going to be phone-based, and I can imagine a number of scenarios where people may feel reluctant to share their phone with someone. I can think of maybe being pulled over by police and passing over your phone for a digital ID, and then all of a sudden, does this, police officer have access to my phone? What are you hearing, from Ontarians about sort of with a digital ID? Will they feel safe about sort of their information being kept private?
This is another one of those things where it really depends on the scenario. So that example you brought up of a police officer, that's something where I spoke to a professor of digital media, Aaron Morrow at Brock University, who's got expertise in privacy. And he was saying that was something that would really worry him. This idea that I've got my plastic driver's license. Why would I risk opening up my phone to potentially having an officer gain access to the private information I keep in there? So I asked the government about this, and in this situation, they've said that it's still under consultation. They don't yet know how it will work or whether you have to unlock your phone or whether you can have your phone locked and show that ID. But they've also showed situations where you could use the digital ID to show less information than you otherwise might. So, for example, right now, if you go to the LCBO or to a bar, you've got to show your driver's license maybe, and that's got your birthday and your address on it. And maybe some people like it when a bouncer wishes you happy birthday, but other people would maybe just rather not share that. So there would be the ability with the digital ID to just show only that you're over 19 in order to gain access. And you don't need to show any of that other stuff that's on the card.
Very interesting stuff. And we should mention that these would not replace traditional government IDs like your driver's license or your photo ID. Justin, I want to thank you so much, something that, of course, we will continue to follow. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hey, Steve, so you know Queen's Park backwards and forwards. I'm hoping you can break some stuff down for me.
Well, I've been there a couple times, but I don't know about backwards and forwards, but let's see what you got.
All right, so this week the throne speech was read at Queen's Park. Can you translate that into non-political terms? What does that mean?
Well, a throne speech is basically a way of kickstarting or rebooting a government's mandate, a government session. And this is only the second one that the Ford government has had. They had their first one, obviously, when they first got elected back in the summer of 2018. So the idea is sort of to say, you know what, let's clear the decks. Let's get a restart to our agenda, if I can use that word here in the studio. And so that's what a speech from the throne's all about.
You said it's their second one in more than 3 years. Is that unusual?
It is unusual, yeah. Governments usually like to kind of update their mandates more often as they go along. For whatever reason, the Ford government's decided this is the first time they've wanted to do it since the beginning. So, yeah, usually there's more than just two at this stage of a government's mandate.
A lot of people don't get a chance to see a throne speech in person. Why is it called a throne speech? Is there a throne involved?
Well, not necessarily here, but there was back in the mother of all parliaments. You got to remember, we're the British parliamentary system, and in the United Kingdom, the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, reads the speech from the throne. And of course, she being the Queen, she does sit on a throne when she gives the speech from the throne. In the junior countries, if I can put it that way, the Queen's representative gives the speech from the throne. So, of course, in Ottawa, it's the Governor General. In all the provinces, it's the Lieutenant Governor. And so the Queen's representative, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, gives what's still called the speech from the throne, even though she's really just sitting in the Speaker's chair.
And I do want to make sure I got this right. It's not Elizabeth Dowdeswell's script. This is from the government.
That is exactly right. And it's a good thing to remember, because we would not want people watching the speech from the throne thinking, why is the Lieutenant Governor being, so partisan in what she is advocating? Well, she's not. The government writes the speech. The Lieutenant Governor delivers the speech. Now, she may have, the odd suggestion that goes in there to make sure that it's in her voice. But the fact is, she is reading the speech on behalf of the government as the government outlines its aspirations for the coming term.
Underwhelming, uninspiring is sort of the words that have been sort of thrown out to describe this year's throne speech. Is this more a policy statement or a political statement? Well,
it depends who you are. If you're the government of the day, and I don't know how many of these things I've seen, but probably dozens of them, you can almost write the script ahead of time, right? The government is going to speak in lofty, aspirational tone. They're not necessarily going to be very specific about what they intend to do and when they intend to do it by. The opposition, conversely, you can write their script ahead of time as well. They will say, not specific enough, no targets, no deadlines, no nothing, what a waste of time. They were saying it back when I was covering Bill Davis's throne speeches almost 40 years ago, and they're saying it again today. But that's what it is. It is theater of politics, right? The idea is just to get the aspirations and the ideas out there, and then presumably it's a bit of a roadmap for what you intend to do during the rest of the session.
You talked about theater. There's some etiquette that's involved in theater, and some interesting stuff that you wrote about earlier this week about how this throne speech was quite different from 2018. How so?
It was very different in as much as, and can I put it this way, in as much as the government members who attended behaved. People may not remember this, but 3+ years ago, when the government brought in its first throne speech, the Ford government thought it got elected to come in and be as disruptive as possible to the status quo politically as it related to everything. And the Lieutenant Governor read the throne speech 3+ years ago, and when backbench members of the government heard things that they liked, they started hooting and hollering and clapping and, okay, you don't do that during a throne speech.
Well, she gave the stare down.
She sure did. At one point, she lifted her eyes from the text and she looked at the government members and she literally stared, not literally, but it felt like it, stared daggers at them, as if to say, would you all please shut up while I read this thing? We're not, conducting a circus here. This is supposed to be a bit of an august event with some grace and dignity involved. They never got that message then. They did this time. They were much more sober and appropriately behaved, and as a result, I thought it did come off with a lot more grace and etiquette.
You talked about disruption. I want to pull up a quote and make sure I want to get this right. You wrote in your article, determined to disrupt everything that was normal about public life in Ontario. And that was talking about the Conservative government when they came into power in 2018. Is it unusual for the Progressive Conservatives side of the legislature to be sort of taking that stance?
Well, if you compare this incarnation of the Progressive Conservative Party under Doug Ford to previous ones, say Mike Harris, going back before that, Frank Miller, going back before that, Bill Davis, John Robarts, Leslie Frost, doesn't matter how far back you want to go. Yes, this group of progressive conservatives believes it got elected to be disruptive to the status quo, and with very much a populist tinge to it all. But I think one of the most interesting stories that has developed over the last 3 years is the fact that whatever it was that Doug Ford wanted to be when he came into office, he's changed. He's taken advice from people who have told him, you know what, that whole circus routine you were doing 3 years ago wasn't really working. And you became very unpopular very quickly. And if you want to get reelected, you might want to start acting in a more normal fashion. And the Ford government, you could say to its credit, has done that. Now, we'll find out next June whether or not the public signs off on it, but clearly they have decided to act in a more normal fashion the closer we get to the next election.
Very interesting stuff, and maybe a topic for next time. Thank you so much.
We shall see. Good to see you, JN. This is kind of neat, this little
I like it.
Casual, informal chit-chat we have here.
The agenda this week learned why housing shortages aren't just a problem in Canada and heard about some new technologies for the fight against climate change. The agenda's Week in Review begins asking, how should police handle protesters?
Let's take some little look-see here at some pictures that you shot. I guess this is a little over a week ago at the Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would. Okay, to the average observer, Karima, that looks like a bit of a demonstration that is perhaps on the verge of getting a little bit out of hand. What are you seeing there, though, that goes beyond that?
I'm seeing people trying to force their way into the Eaton Centre. And in so doing, there are assaults on security guards, assaults on police, and really just a general recklessness for public health and safety. And this was one of the escalations that I've observed. So over the past few months, it's ranged from yelling at strangers on the street to the occasional physical confrontation. And that escalation is concerning.
Now, you just used the word assault to describe what you saw. That's a legal term. Do you know if, in fact, anybody was charged with assault on that occasion?
There were at least 2 people charged with assault. But if we look closely at the video, I think that there are a few more who could have received charges. And I'm not one to call for heavy-handed police action. But I think that the police response overall to anti-vax demonstrations has emboldened the protesters. And, I'll use the word escalation again, because I think that that's what we're seeing.
Okay, you better follow up on that, because are you suggesting that the police's behavior, that the way that they have responded to the anti-vax protests has in fact encouraged them to get more violent?
I think that that's a possibility. I think that there are various factors and variables at play. But if we compare some of the police response to the anti-vax protests versus behavior in other situations, such as encampments, I think that there's a very clear difference, and it's something that needs to be looked at. And even speaking to police officers during these anti-vax protests, it really tended to be a hands-off approach. We respect the right to protest, which is not inherently a problematic thing. But again, the discrepancy in treatment, I think, is something that has emboldened people.
You have heard the allegation that not all police officers in all police services across this country handle all protest circumstances the same. And we have heard the allegation, for example, that when it comes to, let's say, clearing homeless shelters out of a public park, the police may be a lot more direct and a lot more forceful, and at the end of the day may make many, many more arrests than they would, for example, in the case of trying to prevent anti-vax demonstrators from entering a shopping mall, the example I just gave. You've heard that allegation. Do you think there's something to it?
Well, I have heard that allegation, but I think there are probably many more aspects to that. It depends on what that group is doing. So sometimes, in the first example, each situation will be different. The people that you're moving out of a park, for example, that might be their entire, everything they own is there. And so the chance of that getting more emotional and more emotionally charged of a situation is probably higher. So, I don't know, our officers attend, millions of calls a year. And that includes, situations where you're asking people to move along. And I think they're very professional in how they do that. And sometimes there are court injunctions involved in those. So sometimes, the ability to enforce something is greater in different situations. So the park example, there might be a bylaw that says people can't be there and setting up camp during the daytime hours, versus a protest in a street, and there may not be a bylaw that says you can't be there. So like there are very, very many different facets to that. But I would say on the whole, our members are very professional and deal with each situation as it comes.
No, I appreciate the nuance that you just gave in that example, but that doesn't quite, you'll forgive me, I don't think that quite gets at it, because the allegation in this case is there are many more police officers who may be in sympathy themselves with the message behind the anti-vax demonstrators, and that's why they cut them a little more slack than they would, say, the homeless people who are gathered in their tents in a public park, for whom the police, let's say, have less personal sympathy. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it is fair to say. I think it's fair to say. I don't agree it's so. Our police officers across Canada, and we have a rule of law in Canada, and professional police officers, and we see countries around the world where that is not the case. We don't, individual officers have individual beliefs on many, many different areas. And if that was what determined their involvement in many scenarios, that would be very challenging. They set those aside and they deal with the situation professionally. And that is a requirement. If you can't do that, then you're in the wrong occupation.
Mike, why has supply become such an issue of late?
Well, I'd actually say that this issue goes back to about 2015 in Ontario, and it's all due to population growth. Ontario typically grows by about 100 to 120,000 people every single year, and we did rather consistently. But we had some policy changes starting in 2015, increased immigration targets, and also a more attractive market for international students. We basically changed how long international students could stay in the province after they graduate. So all of a sudden, we went from growing at about 120,000 people a year to 200,000 people a year. So we've grown by almost 1 million people over the last 5 years. If we compare the last 5 years to the previous 5 years, we've had 300,000 extra people in the province, but we've only built about 30,000 extra homes, and most of those are one-bedroom condos. So you do the math there, that's 9 or 10 extra people for every one-bedroom condo. That is going to get you a housing shortage.
Now, why is it that somewhere along the way, decision makers didn't say to themselves, we're inviting a whole lot of extra people in here and we're not giving them anywhere to live? Why didn't they make that computation?
Well, it's this fantastic problem that we have in Canada about jurisdictionality. So we have a federal government that sets rules around immigration and international student policy. Then we have the province who set their sort of growth plans and need to sort of adjust for that accordingly. And we have colleges and universities bringing in international students. And then we have the municipalities making their plans off of the provincial growth plan. And all of that takes time. And if we look at provincial growth or municipal growth plans across the province, some of these are anywhere from 5 to 15 years out of date. They don't incorporate the new immigration targets, all of those changes that are going on. And it all goes to this sort of jurisdictional problem where different levels of government are responsible for different things, and they don't necessarily interact well with each other.
Gotcha. Jenny, maybe you could give us the lay of the land in the United States, and in particular, what states the housing shortage is particularly acute.
Well, we've seen pretty similar dynamics to Canada at the national level. So house prices are up over 13% year over year, which is obviously faster than people's wages are growing. And we have similar kinds of issues on the supply side, plus demand side issues as well. So we're sandwiched between two historically large generations, the boomers, the older end, and millennials on the younger side. It's just a lot of people. Millennials in particular are reaching their peak home buying years. They're getting ready to move out of the one-bedroom apartments, buy their first house, have a little bit of extra space, and there aren't enough homes to accommodate all the people who want to live there. This has been traditionally true in places like New York and San Francisco and Boston, but we're actually seeing very rapid home price growth in some of the smaller metros, places like Boise, Idaho, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado. Those are seeing now the kinds of upwards pressure on housing prices that we've mostly associated with the big coastal cities. And the big question is, will Boise become San Francisco in 10 years?
So this is not just a blue state thing. This is happening in the red states too.
Absolutely. And we've seen some of the strongest rates of population growth and demand in places like Texas and Arizona. So the Sun Belt states have very strong demand for housing. They've traditionally built enough housing to accommodate growth, but they just haven't been able to keep up for the last couple of years.
Okay, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, if he would, to bring up the chart, Sheldon, on page 2. This is housing units per 1,000 population in G7 countries, and we're going to compare just a half a dozen or so of the major countries: France, Denmark, Japan, the UK, the US, and Canada. And for those listening on podcast and who can't see this, the bar graphs here, France seems to be doing much better than most in terms of building adequate housing per 1,000 population. Denmark in second, Japan in third, all of those countries above the G7 average. But then you get to the UK, the US, and Canada, and we are all building less than the average home building that is taking place in the G7. And Jenny, we heard some of the explanations for why it's that way in the province of Ontario. Maybe if you could broaden the microscope a bit and tell us why would it be this way across the G7 in so many places?
Notice that what we're particularly seeing is tight restrictions on supply in the Anglo countries, and that's because they share a similar approach to land use governance and development. In particular, we've chosen to devolve control over land use and development to local governments, and the process tends to empower existing residents. So people who already live in a community don't necessarily want more houses added. They're very sensitive about their property values, so they don't want rental housing added. And those existing homeowners come out to community meetings and complain about things and push back. That tends to block development or delay it, dragging out the process and making it more expensive. And if you think about who would benefit from building homes, it's usually people who don't already live in a community.
David, start us off on a discussion about nuclear energy. Do we need more of it to help us get through the climate crisis?
I would like to see more nuclear power because it has a low land footprint. And so if you're going to, I think one challenge of decarbonization is that there's no question we can decarbonize without nuclear power. The absolutely stunning improvements in the cost of solar mean that the pathway to large-scale decarbonization with solar looks much more real than it did 10 years ago. And my view is there's no necessity for nuclear. But there are lots of other technologies like hydro and wind, which have and biomass, which have comparatively big land and environmental footprints. And I do think, especially in a cold place with big winters like Canada, if you want to think about ways that solve the climate problem, that is stop putting CO2 in the air, and also reduce other environmental harms, I think it's important to take nuclear seriously. But that said, if you ask me how to do it, how practically, like which reactor technology and what government policy and what way to communicate with the public could get to something that exactly, as Holly said, is a socio-technical system that makes nuclear work, I have no idea. Every element of that is broken. Public trust is broken. The companies that develop these technologies have done in some ways a terrible job. I also have just horrific experiences from being on a top panel in Canada and talking to people at the Canadian Nuclear Agency and literally, no exaggeration, being lied to. So my faith as somebody who's a physicist and pro-nuclear in AECL just went to zero in that experience. So we've got broken trust, high costs and problems. Yet I still think there actually is some real use for developing nuclear power in a climate future, and it's a big challenge to figure out how to do it.
AECL being Atomic Energy of Canada, the once upon a time Crown Corporation. Okay, Holly, you are literally a hop and a skip and a jump away from the Ontario border, and we depend on nuclear for about half of our energy mix, maybe some days more than half of our electricity mix here in the province of Ontario. I'm not sure what it is in New York State, where you are, but is it an option, do you think, to help get us out of the climate crisis?
Yes, I do. I don't think it's perfect. I think we're out of perfect options. And I'm very concerned about, as a sociologist, about social backlash to higher prices or lack of reliable energy. We've seen some fluctuations lately, with blackouts, with gas shortages in other parts of the world. Nuclear could be a solution to that. And if we don't fix that soon, I think all of our decarbonization goals could be threatened.
Marcus, what's your take on nuclear?
Somewhat similar. The scientist in me sees that it's a low footprint, low carbon electricity source. And if our goal is looking at climate or specifically looking at greenhouse gas load, it's something we have to take seriously. But I grew up in Ontario. I live in now California, where there's discussion of closing nuclear facilities. I'm always struck at how much dissonance there is between sort of the science view of things and what the general person that I'll ask, hey, what do you think about nuclear power is? A lot of people just think it's a disastrous idea. They think it's a symbol of the worst excesses of our industrial age. I don't quite see it that way. I think it can have a future, but I sort of agree that we don't have a lot of public space to actually have that conversation, and it's possible we may not be able to navigate through that. So it's hard to say, but I think it can have a future, but it'll be pretty tricky.
Gotcha.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, October 8th, 2021. Monday will give way for the Thanksgiving holiday and an airing of the slow documentary, Tripping the Niagara. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great holiday weekend, and Steve, we'll see you again on Tuesday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.